What did the world look like before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, and before Egypt became one of history's greatest civilizations? Tonight, we'll journey back thousands of years to explore the lost world of the Green Sahara, the first Nile communities, mysterious forgotten tribes, and the rise of the earliest kings. Welcome to Sleepy Earth Channel. Before we begin, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from, and settle in for a relaxing journey into the distant past. Imagine standing on the banks of the Nile and looking across a landscape without pyramids, without temples, without statues of kings staring across the desert. No pharaohs rule from distant palaces. No scribes record the names of dynasties. No great monuments rise above the horizon. The Egypt that most people recognize simply does not exist. In fact, if you traveled back far enough, you would find a world so different that even the familiar shape of the land would seem strangely foreign. To understand how one of history's most remarkable civilizations emerged, it helps to begin before civilization itself had fully taken root, at a time when humanity was still adapting to a planet undergoing enormous change. Around 12,000 years ago, the Earth was leaving behind the last ice age. Vast ice sheets that had covered large parts of North America and Northern Europe for thousands of years were retreating. The process was neither simple nor smooth. Temperatures rose, then sometimes fell again. Entire ecosystems shifted. Rivers changed course, coastlines moved. Landscapes that had existed for generations disappeared within the span of a few human lifetimes. For people living through these changes, the world may have seemed unpredictable in ways that are difficult to imagine today. The end of the Ice Age is often described as a warming event, but that description can make it sound calm and gradual. In reality, many regions experienced dramatic transformations. As glaciers melted, enormous quantities of water flowed into the oceans. Sea levels began rising. Areas that had once been dry land slowly vanished beneath expanding coastlines. Some researchers estimate that global sea levels rose by more than 100 meters compared to their Ice Age lows. Ancient campsites, hunting grounds, and migration routes that people once depended upon now rest beneath modern seas, hidden from view and largely inaccessible to archaeologists. At this moment in history, there was no Egypt, because there were no nations in the modern sense anywhere on Earth. Human communities existed, of course, but most were small and deeply connected to the rhythms of nature. Survival depended on understanding animals, seasons, plants, rivers, and weather patterns. Knowledge passed from one generation to another not through written records, but through memory, storytelling, and lived experience. Entire histories could disappear if a community vanished or migrated elsewhere. Across much of the world, people still lived as hunter-gatherers. This lifestyle is sometimes misunderstood as primitive or temporary, as if humanity were merely waiting to invent agriculture. Yet archaeological evidence suggests many of these groups possessed sophisticated knowledge of their environments. They understood migration routes, seasonal resources, medicinal plants, and ecological relationships that modern societies often overlook. Their lives were challenging, but they were not simple. In many ways, they represented the culmination of tens of thousands of years of human adaptation. If we could look down upon northeastern Africa during this period, we would not see borders, cities, or kingdoms. Instead, We would see scattered communities moving through landscapes that were themselves changing. The Nile existed, but it was not yet the organizing force behind a centralized civilization. The river flowed through regions occupied by different groups whose lives were shaped far more by local conditions than by any larger political identity. One of the most fascinating aspects of this period is how little certainty exists. Archaeologists can uncover tools, bones, campsites, and traces of ancient activity, but reconstructing the lives of people who left no written records requires careful interpretation. Every discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, yet many pieces remain missing. This uncertainty is not a weakness of the story. If anything, it makes the story more compelling. The deeper we travel into prehistory, the more the familiar world begins to dissolve into possibilities. At the same time, extraordinary developments were unfolding elsewhere. In parts of the Near East, some communities were beginning experiments that would eventually transform human history. People started spending longer periods in certain locations. Wild grains were gathered in increasing quantities. Settlements became more permanent. These changes did not happen overnight, nor did they follow a single path. Different groups adapted in different ways, yet, taken together, they hint at a broader transition that would eventually lead toward agriculture and the rise of complex societies. What makes this particularly interesting is that nobody at the time knew where these developments would lead. We often look backward and see civilization as inevitable. The pyramids, cities, writing systems, and empires seem like destinations humanity was always moving toward. But from the perspective of the people living 12,000 years ago, the future was unwritten. Countless paths remained possible. Entire cultures could flourish or disappear. Environmental shifts could create opportunities or destroy them. History had not yet chosen its direction. Meanwhile, animals that are now rare or absent in many regions occupied landscapes that looked very different from those of today. Herds moved across grasslands. Wetlands supported rich ecosystems. Predators followed prey through territories that would later become deserts or farmland. Human beings were part of this broader ecological world, rather than standing apart from it. Their fortunes rose and fell alongside environmental changes beyond their control. This relationship between climate and human history would prove especially important. Again and again, archaeological evidence suggests that environmental change influenced where people settled, how they obtained food, and which communities prospered. Climate alone does not explain history, but it often shapes the conditions under which history unfolds. The rise of Egypt would eventually depend upon a remarkable combination of geography, water, resources, and human innovation. Yet none of those elements existed in their later form at this early stage. Perhaps the most surprising realization is how much of the ancient world has vanished. Modern maps can create the illusion of permanence. Rivers, deserts, and coastlines appear fixed. Yet, geological and climatic records reveal constant change. Entire lakes have disappeared. Grasslands have become deserts. Productive regions have become barren. Human populations adapted, migrated, and reinvented themselves in response. The world before Egypt was not simply an earlier version of Egypt. It was, in many respects, an entirely different world. As we move closer to the story of the Nile, another question begins to emerge. If Egypt did not yet exist, where did the people who would eventually build it come from? What experiences shaped them? What landscapes taught them how to survive? The answer may lie far beyond the river itself, in places that today seem almost impossible to connect with the origins of one of history's greatest civilizations. Because the next stage of this story does not begin beside the pyramids. It does not begin in royal tombs or temple complexes. It begins in a place that modern travelers know as one of the harshest environments on Earth. A place of endless sand, scorching temperatures, and seemingly lifeless horizons. Yet thousands of years ago, that same region may have looked astonishingly different. Before Egypt emerged, before the first pharaoh claimed authority over the Nile, before the foundations of the pyramids were even imaginable, a vast green world stretched across what is now the Sahara. And understanding that lost landscape may be the key to understanding everything that came after. If a traveler were somehow carried across North Africa 10,000 years ago, there is a good chance they would struggle to recognize the landscape beneath them. The endless oceans of sand that define the modern Sahara would be nowhere in sight across vast stretches of the region. Instead, they might look down upon a world threaded with rivers, dotted with lakes, and covered by grasslands that stretched toward distant horizons. Herds of animals moved through open plains. Birds gathered around wetlands. Fish swam in waters that no longer exist. In some places, the scene may have resembled parts of modern East Africa far more than the Sahara that fills our imagination today. It is one of the most extraordinary environmental transformations in human history, and perhaps one of the least appreciated. The largest hot desert on Earth was once alive with water. For centuries, this idea would have sounded impossible. Early travelers crossing the Sahara encountered a landscape so harsh that it seemed permanent. Towering dunes, rocky plateaus, blistering heat, and immense distances created the impression of an environment unchanged for ages. Yet, scattered clues hinted at a different past. Ancient rock paintings appeared in places where almost no large animals could survive today. Images showed giraffes, antelope, cattle, crocodiles, and even hippopotamuses. At first glance, some observers wondered whether the artists had imagined these creatures. But as evidence accumulated across thousands of sites, a different explanation became impossible to ignore. The animals were real. The environment had once supported them. Modern climate research has helped explain how such a dramatic transformation occurred. The answer lies not in a single event, but in subtle changes in Earth's relationship to the Sun. Over long periods, slight variations in the planet's orbit alter the distribution of solar energy reaching different regions. Around the beginning of the African humid period, these shifts strengthened seasonal monsoon systems. Moisture traveled farther north than it does today. Rainfall increased across enormous areas of North Africa. What appears fixed on human timescales turned out to be surprisingly flexible when viewed across thousands of years. The Sahara did not suddenly become green overnight. It gradually awakened. As rainfall increased, vegetation expanded. Grasslands spread across regions that now receive almost no precipitation. Lakes filled natural depressions in the landscape. Some grew to astonishing sizes. Geological evidence suggests that certain ancient lakes rivaled modern inland seas. Shorelines formed. Fish populations flourished. Wetlands attracted birds and mammals. Water transformed not only the appearance of the land, but also the opportunities available to the people living there. Human communities adapted quickly to these changing conditions. Rather than clustering around a few limited water sources, groups could occupy much broader territories. Archaeological discoveries reveal evidence of fishing, hunting, gathering, and eventually herding across regions that are now nearly uninhabitable. Stone tools, pottery fragments, campsites, and burial grounds tell the story of populations taking advantage of an environment rich in resources. In many ways, the Green Sahara was not a marginal frontier. It was a thriving world. One of the most fascinating discoveries involves ancient lake beds that today appear as barren expanses of cracked earth. Beneath their surfaces, researchers have uncovered traces of vibrant ecosystems and human activity. Some former shorelines contain evidence of repeated occupation over long periods. People return to the same locations generation after generation, suggesting a degree of stability that would be difficult to imagine in the modern desert. These were not merely passing camps. Some may have been important centers within larger networks of movement and exchange. The presence of water also changed relationships between distant communities. Travel across North Africa became more practical than it would later be. Lakes, rivers, and grasslands created corridors connecting regions that are now separated by formidable desert barriers. Ideas, technologies, and cultural practices could move through these landscapes, along with people themselves, while archaeologists continue debating the scale of such interactions. The Green Sahara appears increasingly less like an isolated wilderness and more like a connected human world. Animals played a central role within this environment. Herds of wild cattle grazed alongside antelope and gazelle. Elephants roamed areas where not a single one survives today. Crocodiles inhabited waterways far from the modern Nile. Hippos occupied lakes that have long since vanished. The variety of species preserved in rock art offers a remarkable glimpse into ecosystems that would otherwise be difficult to reconstruct. These images are more than artistic expressions. They function almost like snapshots from a lost age. The rock art itself raises intriguing questions. Some scenes appear straightforward, depicting animals and daily life. Others are more enigmatic. Certain figures seem ceremonial or symbolic. Human forms are sometimes shown in unusual poses. Interpretations vary. Some researchers view these images primarily as records of the surrounding world. Others suggest they may reflect spiritual beliefs, social identities, or ritual practices. Without written explanations, certainty remains elusive. Yet, the mystery adds another layer to the story. The people who lived in the Green Sahara were not merely surviving. They were creating meaning, expressing ideas, and shaping cultures whose details remain largely hidden from us. Among the most significant developments during this period was the gradual rise of cattle herding. Evidence from several regions suggests that livestock became increasingly important to certain communities. The relationship between humans and cattle extended beyond simple food production. In many pastoral societies throughout history, livestock represented wealth, status, social bonds, and cultural identity. Some archaeologists believe similar dynamics may have emerged in parts of the Green Sahara. If so, these communities were experimenting with social structures that would influence later developments across northeastern Africa. Yet even during its most fertile centuries, the Green Sahara was not a paradise. Rainfall fluctuated, resources varied across regions, communities still faced challenges, competition, and uncertainty. Environmental abundance can support larger populations, but it can also create new pressures. Questions about territory, water access, migration routes, and livestock management may have become increasingly important. The archaeological record preserves hints of these complexities, even if the full stories remain beyond our reach. What makes this chapter of history particularly compelling is how fragile it ultimately proved to be. The forces that had transformed the Sahara were not permanent. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, climatic patterns began shifting again. Rainfall declined in some areas, lakes started shrinking, grasslands retreated. Communities that had adapted to a greener world faced difficult decisions. Some relocated seasonally, others migrated farther. A landscape that had supported generations began changing once more. The speed of this transformation remains a topic of ongoing research. Certain regions may have dried gradually over centuries. Others appear to have experienced more abrupt environmental shifts. The reality was likely complex and varied from place to place. For the people living through these changes, however, scientific timescales mattered less than practical realities. Water sources became less reliable. Grazing areas diminished. Familiar landscapes became harder to recognize. Choices that once seemed routine suddenly carried greater consequences. As conditions deteriorated, human movements across North Africa intensified. Entire populations may have been pushed toward more dependable sources of water. Among the most important destinations was the Nile Valley. Unlike seasonal lakes and temporary wetlands, the Nile offered a remarkably stable lifeline through an increasingly arid world. Year after year, its waters continued flowing. Year after year, fertile soils accumulated along its banks. In a region becoming less predictable, the river's reliability grew more valuable. This possibility has profound implications. The rise of ancient Egypt is often associated with the Nile itself, and rightly so. Yet the people who eventually contributed to Egyptian civilization may have carried experiences, traditions, skills, beliefs, and knowledge acquired far beyond the river. Some of the foundations of later developments may have originated in landscapes that no longer exist. The desert surrounding Egypt today can make it easy to imagine isolation. The Green Sahara suggests a very different reality. Before the desert became a barrier, it may have been a bridge. There is something almost poetic about this transformation. One of the world's greatest civilizations may owe part of its existence to an environment that disappeared. The grasslands vanished, the lakes evaporated. Many migration routes were erased by advancing sands. Yet traces of that lost world survived in the movements of people and the choices they made as conditions changed. In that sense, the Green Sahara never truly disappeared. It may have continued living through the societies that emerged after it was gone. Standing in the modern Sahara, surrounded by silence and sand, it is difficult to imagine waves lapping against ancient shorelines or herds moving across open grasslands. The landscape seems eternal. But beneath the dunes lie reminders that permanence is often an illusion. Environments change. Human societies adapt. Entire worlds can emerge and vanish within the span of history. And as the Green Sahara slowly faded from existence, countless people found themselves drawn toward a river that would soon become one of the most important places on Earth. Along its banks, a new chapter was beginning to take shape. Though nobody living at the time could have known where that path would eventually lead, long before Egypt became a kingdom, before royal names were carved into stone, before the first pyramid builders even existed as an idea, a narrow ribbon of life stretched through northeastern Africa. Seen from above, it would have appeared almost improbable. On either side lay increasingly dry landscapes, but cutting through them was a river unlike any other. The Nile did not simply flow across the land, it created a living corridor that transformed everything around it. For the people who gradually settled along its banks, the river was not yet sacred in the way later Egyptians would imagine it, nor was it the center of a powerful state. It was something far more immediate. It was food, water, movement, survival, and, perhaps most importantly, stability in a world that often offered very little of it. The Nile begins far to the south, gathering water from enormous distances before carrying it north toward the Mediterranean. What made this river remarkable was not merely its size, but its behavior. Each year, long before anyone understood the mechanics behind it, the river rose and spilled across portions of its floodplain. The cause lay hundreds and even thousands of miles away in seasonal rainfall across eastern Africa. To the people living beside the Nile, however, the flood must have felt almost magical. Water arrived with astonishing regularity. When it receded, it left behind dark, fertile silt capable of supporting plants far more effectively than the surrounding terrain. At first, the earliest communities along the Nile were not cities, villages, or organized settlements in the later sense. They were small groups of people taking advantage of an environment that consistently provided opportunities. Archaeological evidence suggests that many communities combined fishing, hunting, gathering wild plants, and eventually forms of animal management and cultivation. Life remained flexible. The river offered resources throughout the year, reducing some of the uncertainty that defined existence elsewhere. One of the easiest mistakes to make when imagining these early populations is to picture them as isolated pioneers discovering an empty land. In reality, the Nile Valley was likely becoming a meeting place for people arriving from different directions. Some may have moved gradually toward the river as environmental conditions changed elsewhere. Others may have maintained seasonal movements between regions. Over generations, diverse experiences and traditions likely converged along the Nile. This mixture may prove more important than any single migration. Civilizations rarely emerge from one source. They are usually built from many streams flowing together, much like the river itself. The physical landscape would have looked different from the familiar Egypt seen in documentaries and photographs today. The river shifted channels over time. Wetlands occupied areas that later disappeared. Wildlife flourished in habitats that no longer exist. Crocodiles basked along riverbanks. Hippos moved through waterways. Fish populations supported both human communities and larger ecosystems. Birds migrating between continents found refuge in marshes and lagoons. The Nile Valley was not merely a river corridor. It was a biological crossroads connecting regions separated by vast distances. For the people living there, knowledge of the river became one of the most valuable forms of wealth. Understanding seasonal patterns could mean the difference between abundance and hardship. Knowing where fish gathered, where animals crossed, or where floodwaters reached particular areas allowed communities to thrive. Unlike physical possessions, this knowledge accumulated over generations. Parents taught children, Elders passed experience to younger members of the group. Long before written records existed, memory itself functioned as a survival technology. Archaeological discoveries reveal evidence of increasingly permanent occupation in certain locations. Camps that may once have been seasonal became places where people returned repeatedly. Structures became more substantial. Storage practices improved. The significance of these developments is easy to underestimate because they lack the dramatic appearance of later monuments. Yet permanence changes everything. The moment people begin expecting to return to the same location year after year, new possibilities emerge. Relationships to land become more meaningful. Investments in infrastructure become worthwhile. Communities gain continuity. This continuity may also have changed how people thought about time. Highly mobile groups often focus on seasonal cycles and immediate opportunities. More settled populations begin thinking across longer horizons. They prepare for future harvests. They maintain places used by previous generations. They create traditions tied to specific locations. The Nile encouraged this shift because its rhythms were unusually dependable. In a sense, the river taught patience. It rewarded those who understood repetition and planning. Food sources expanded as communities learned more about the environment. Fishing remained important, but people also gathered wild grains, exploited aquatic plants, hunted game, and gradually experimented with forms of cultivation. The exact sequence of these developments remains debated among researchers. Different regions appear to have followed different paths. What matters is not a single invention, but a broader trend. Human groups were becoming increasingly skilled at shaping their surroundings, rather than merely reacting to them. The growth of food production brought consequences that extended beyond nutrition. Larger and more reliable food supplies could support larger populations. Larger populations created new social challenges. Cooperation became more important. Disputes required resolution. Leadership roles emerged. Tasks became more specialized. None of this happened overnight, and the process was undoubtedly uneven. Yet, the foundations of more complex societies were beginning to appear. Burial practices provide another intriguing glimpse into changing ways of life. Some graves from this period contain objects placed alongside the deceased. These items suggest that people were beginning to express ideas about identity, status, memory, or perhaps beliefs concerning death itself. Interpretations vary. Archaeologists must be cautious when reconstructing ancient belief systems. Nevertheless, the evidence hints at communities becoming socially and culturally more complex. The dead were not simply abandoned. They remained connected to the living through ritual and remembrance. One fascinating question concerns how these early populations viewed the river itself. Later Egyptian civilization would develop elaborate religious concepts linked to the Nile, portraying its annual floods as essential to cosmic order. Whether similar beliefs existed among these earlier communities remains uncertain. It is possible that spiritual relationships with water, animals, landscapes, or seasonal cycles were already emerging. Human societies throughout history have often attached symbolic meaning to the forces that sustain them. The Nile may have inspired reverence long before formal religion took shape. Trade likely played a growing role as well. Even relatively small communities rarely exist in complete isolation. Materials found at archaeological sites sometimes originated far from where they were discovered. Stone, shells, pigments, and other resources moved between groups through exchange networks that could span considerable distances. Such interactions carried more than physical goods. Ideas traveled alongside them. Technologies spread. Cultural practices evolved through contact with outsiders. The Nile itself acted as a natural highway. Moving along a river is often easier than crossing difficult terrain. Boats, even simple ones, expanded mobility and connected communities separated by hundreds of miles. While evidence for early river transport remains incomplete, the logic is compelling. A river that flows through thousands of miles of landscape naturally encourages communication. Long before political unity existed, the Nile may have been creating a sense of connection among otherwise distant populations. Yet life beside the river was never entirely secure. Floods could vary in intensity, animal attacks remained a threat, disease existed, environmental fluctuations still occurred. The river reduced certain risks, but it did not eliminate uncertainty. This balance between opportunity and vulnerability may help explain why innovation continued. Communities could not simply depend on nature. They had to learn, adapt, and prepare. As generations passed, the relationship between people and the Nile deepened. What began as a useful environment increasingly became a framework for organizing life itself. Settlements grew, social structures evolved, knowledge accumulated. Certain locations gained importance because of access to resources, transportation routes, or fertile land. Patterns that seem ordinary at first glance gradually began producing larger consequences. Looking back, it is tempting to search for a single moment when Egypt's future became inevitable. The evidence suggests no such moment existed. Instead, countless small decisions unfolded over centuries. Families chose where to settle. Communities developed techniques for managing resources. Networks expanded. Traditions formed. Each step appeared modest when viewed in isolation. Together, however, they created conditions unlike those found in most other regions. Perhaps that is the most remarkable aspect of this chapter in the story. The people living beside the Nile were not trying to build a civilization that would endure for thousands of years. They were solving immediate problems, raising families, finding food, and adapting to their environment. Yet through those ordinary actions, something extraordinary was beginning to emerge. The river that sustained them was quietly weaving together the foundations of a future no one could yet imagine. And as these communities became more settled, more connected, and more dependent upon the fertile lands along the Nile, another transformation was approaching. Human beings were about to take a step that would reshape not only their relationship with the river, but also their relationship with each other. The age of simple settlement was gradually giving way to something far more ambitious. Along the banks of the Nile, the earliest seeds of organized agriculture were beginning to take root, and with them came changes that would alter the course of history. There is a moment in many great historical stories that appears surprisingly ordinary when viewed up close. No armies march across the horizon. No kings announce a new age. No monuments rise from the earth. Instead, a few people make practical decisions that seem almost insignificant at the time. They save seeds rather than consuming them. They remain in one place a little longer than their parents did. They begin paying closer attention to which plants grow best after the floodwaters retreat. Yet hidden within those small choices is a transformation so profound that it would eventually reshape societies, economies, religions, and political systems across entire continents. Along the Nile Valley, one of those transformations was quietly unfolding. Long before Egypt emerged as a kingdom, the foundations of agriculture were beginning to change how people understood the world around them. For thousands of years, human survival had depended largely on adapting to nature's rhythms. People moved when resources shifted. They followed seasonal opportunities. Even communities with relatively stable settlements remained deeply dependent on what the environment naturally provided. Agriculture introduced a subtle but revolutionary idea. Instead of simply responding to nature, people could begin influencing it. The change was not absolute, and it certainly was not immediate. Nature still held enormous power. Floods, droughts, pests, and disease remained constant threats. Yet, for the first time, human beings were learning to shape portions of their environment with increasing confidence. The Nile created conditions that made this transition especially attractive. Every year, floodwaters spread nutrient-rich sediment across portions of the valley. When the waters receded, fertile soil remained behind. Unlike many regions where farming required extensive irrigation from the beginning, parts of the Nile Valley naturally renewed themselves through the river's annual cycle. To early communities, this recurring process must have seemed remarkably reliable. Areas that produced food one year often produced food again the next. Patterns became visible. Predictability encouraged experimentation. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the 6th and 5th millennia BCE, various communities in Egypt and neighboring regions were already incorporating domesticated plants and animals into their lives. The process was neither uniform nor simple. Different groups adopted different strategies. Some relied heavily on livestock. Others combined cultivation with fishing and hunting. There was no single agricultural revolution occurring everywhere at once. Instead, countless local experiments unfolded across generations. Some succeeded, others disappeared. What survived gradually became part of everyday life. One of the most important developments involved grain cultivation. Wheat and barley, which had been domesticated earlier in parts of the Near East, eventually became established in northeastern Africa. These crops offered advantages that extended far beyond nutrition. Grains could be stored. Stored food created options. Communities were no longer entirely dependent on immediate harvests or daily foraging. Surpluses could sustain families through difficult seasons. They could support larger populations. They could even become forms of wealth. The concept of stored wealth may seem unremarkable today, but its consequences were enormous. When food can be accumulated, protected, exchanged, and distributed, social relationships begin to change. Certain families may control larger reserves than others. Some individuals become responsible for managing storage facilities. Cooperation becomes increasingly valuable. At the same time, inequality can begin to emerge. The seeds of future social hierarchies often appear long before formal governments or monarchies exist. Livestock added another layer to this transformation. Cattle, sheep, and goats represented more than sources of meat. They provided milk, hides, labor, and social prestige. In many ancient societies, ownership of animals became closely connected to status and influence. Evidence suggests similar dynamics may have developed among some Nile communities. A herd represented security. It could grow over time. It could be traded. It could survive periods when crops failed. In a world where uncertainty remained a constant companion, livestock offered a measure of stability. Yet agriculture was not automatically an improvement in every respect. This complexity often disappears in simplified histories that portray farming as an obvious step forward. In reality, early agricultural life involved trade-offs. Settled communities became more vulnerable to localized disasters. Crop failures could threaten entire populations. Living in larger groups increased exposure to disease. Daily labor often became more repetitive and physically demanding. Some researchers even argue that certain early farmers experienced poorer health than some of their hunter-gatherer predecessors. The transition was not a straightforward march toward progress. It was an adaptation that created new opportunities while introducing new risks. Perhaps this is what makes the story so fascinating. Agriculture succeeded not because it solved every problem, but because it enabled something unprecedented: growth. Communities capable of producing and storing food could support more people. More people generated more knowledge, more specialization, and more innovation. Over time, these advantages accumulated. Small settlements expanded, networks widened, complexity increased. The landscape itself began reflecting these changes. Seasonal camps increasingly gave way to permanent settlements. Structures became more durable. Storage pits and granaries appeared. Certain locations gained importance because they offered favorable access to fertile land and reliable water. People were no longer simply passing through the landscape. They were investing in it. The difference may sound subtle, but it fundamentally altered the relationship between humans and place. Ownership likely became a more meaningful concept as well. In highly mobile societies, territorial boundaries often remain flexible. Agricultural communities tend to think differently. Fields require protection. Harvests require planning. Investments made during one season are expected to provide benefits in the next. As a result, access to land becomes increasingly important. Archaeologists cannot easily reconstruct the legal systems of prehistoric communities, but the practical realities suggest that questions of territory and resource control were becoming more significant. These developments may also have influenced how people viewed time itself. Farmers live according to cycles. They think about planting seasons, flood schedules, and future harvests. Their attention naturally extends beyond the immediate present. Long-term planning becomes essential. This shift in perspective can have profound cultural consequences. Communities begin preserving knowledge across generations. Calendrical observations become valuable. Understanding environmental patterns becomes increasingly important. One intriguing possibility is that the Nile's annual flooding encouraged some of the earliest systematic observations of natural cycles. While there is no evidence that prehistoric communities possessed the sophisticated calendars of later Egypt, repeated exposure to predictable environmental rhythms almost certainly sharpened awareness of seasonal change. The river became not just a source of resources, but also a teacher. It revealed patterns to those willing to observe them carefully. As settlements grew, social roles likely diversified. Not everyone needed to spend every day acquiring food. Some individuals could devote more attention to tool-making, trade, construction, or specialized knowledge. This division of labor marks one of the most important turning points in human history. Complex societies require specialists. Specialists require surpluses. Surpluses require effective food production. The chain connecting agriculture to civilization is long, but each link depends upon the one before it. Trade networks expanded alongside these developments. Communities exchanged stone, shells, pigments, animal products, and crafted goods. Certain materials traveled considerable distances, demonstrating that people were maintaining connections far beyond their immediate surroundings. Trade carried ideas as well as objects. Agricultural techniques, technologies, and cultural practices could spread through these interactions. The Nile increasingly functioned as both a lifeline and a communication corridor. Burial practices from this period reveal additional layers of social complexity. Some graves contain richer collections of goods than others. Differences in treatment suggest distinctions in status or identity. Such evidence does not necessarily indicate rigid hierarchies, but it hints at societies becoming more structured. The gap between individuals may have been widening. Certain people held greater influence, controlled more resources, or occupied more prestigious positions within their communities. At the same time, spiritual life was evolving. Agricultural societies often develop deeper symbolic relationships with fertility, cycles of renewal, and environmental forces. While direct evidence remains limited, it is difficult to imagine that communities whose survival depended on floods, crops, and livestock viewed these forces as purely practical concerns. Meaning and survival were often intertwined. The rhythms that sustained life may also have shaped emerging belief systems in ways that would later echo through Egyptian religion. Looking back across thousands of years, the remarkable thing is not that agriculture appeared. Similar developments occurred in multiple parts of the world. What stands out is how effectively the Nile Valley transformed agricultural potential into long-term stability. The river provided a rare combination of predictability and productivity. Communities could adapt to its rhythms while benefiting from its resources. Over generations, these advantages accumulated in ways that would become increasingly visible. No one living during this period could have imagined the pyramids. No one could foresee pharaohs, monumental temples, or vast bureaucracies. Yet many of the conditions necessary for those achievements were already taking shape. Population growth, food surpluses, permanent settlements, expanding trade networks, emerging leadership structures, and growing social complexity were quietly laying the groundwork for something larger. The most important consequence of the agricultural transformation may not have been the crops themselves. It was the creation of communities capable of sustaining continuity across generations. Knowledge could accumulate instead of constantly being rediscovered. Traditions could deepen, settlements could expand, ambitions could grow. Human societies were becoming capable of organizing themselves on scales that would have seemed impossible only a few thousand years earlier. And as agriculture strengthened its hold on the Nile Valley, another force was reshaping the wider region. Beyond the river, environmental conditions continued changing. Landscapes that had once supported thriving populations were becoming increasingly difficult to inhabit. Across vast areas of North Africa, people faced choices that would alter the future of the Nile forever. The next chapter of this story would not be driven by abundance alone. It would be shaped by migration, adaptation, and the slow disappearance of an entire world. The disappearance of a civilization is often imagined as a dramatic event. We picture invading armies, collapsing cities, or some sudden catastrophe that leaves ruins behind for future generations to discover. Yet some of the most profound disappearances in human history happen quietly, almost invisibly, unfolding over centuries rather than days. No final battle marked the end. No witness recorded the moment. Instead, entire ways of life slowly faded as the world around them changed. Across the vast landscapes of North Africa, this is exactly what appears to have happened to many of the communities that once thrived throughout the Green Sahara. Their story survives only in fragments: buried campsites, weathered rock art, ancient lake beds, and scattered traces of human lives that vanished long before written history began. Yet understanding what happened to these people may be one of the keys to understanding why the Nile Valley eventually became the center of one of the world's greatest civilizations. By around 6000 BCE, subtle environmental changes were already reshaping parts of the Sahara. The rains that had sustained grasslands, lakes, and wetlands for thousands of years were becoming less reliable. At first, the transformation may not have seemed alarming. Climate rarely announces its intentions. A lake shrinks slightly, a wet season arrives later than expected, a familiar grazing area produces less vegetation than before. Such changes are easy to dismiss when viewed over a few years, but over generations, small shifts accumulate. The landscape that grandparents knew begins to differ from the one their grandchildren inherit. One of the most fascinating aspects of this transition is that people did not simply stand by and watch it happen. Archaeological evidence suggests remarkable adaptability. Communities adjusted migration routes, altered seasonal movements, and developed new survival strategies. In some regions, populations clustered around remaining water sources. In others, people intensified livestock management or expanded trade networks. Human beings have always been resourceful, and the inhabitants of the Sahara were no exception. Yet adaptation has limits. Eventually, the environment itself began changing faster than some traditional ways of life could accommodate. Ancient lakes that had once supported thriving ecosystems started shrinking. Shorelines retreated, wetlands fragmented, rivers that had flowed seasonally became increasingly unreliable. As water sources diminished, competition for access likely increased. While direct evidence remains limited, similar patterns appear throughout human history whenever vital resources become scarce. The challenge was not merely survival in the present, but uncertainty about the future. Communities could endure hardship for a season or even a decade. The greater question was whether their children would inherit a livable landscape. The archaeological record reveals hints of this growing pressure. Some settlements show signs of abandonment. Occupation patterns shift. Areas that once supported substantial populations become sparsely inhabited. Yet what makes this story especially intriguing is that the people themselves do not simply disappear from history. Instead, they seem to move. The evidence increasingly suggests migrations occurring across portions of North Africa as environmental conditions deteriorated. Where exactly everyone went remains an active area of research, but certain destinations appear more likely than others. Among these destinations, the Nile Valley stands out immediately. As surrounding regions became less predictable, the Nile offered something increasingly rare: reliability. Every year, water continued flowing northward. Every year, fertile floodplains regenerated. For communities facing environmental uncertainty elsewhere, the river represented opportunity. It is easy to imagine how powerful that attraction would have been. When landscapes become unstable, people often gravitate toward places where survival appears more secure. This possibility opens a fascinating question. How much of ancient Egypt's future population originated beyond the Nile itself? Scholars continue debating the scale and timing of migrations from the Sahara. Some evidence suggests substantial movement toward the river. Other researchers emphasize continuity among populations already living within the Nile Valley. The truth may involve both processes, operating simultaneously. Human history rarely follows simple either-or explanations. People move, mix, adapt, and integrate in ways that often blur clear distinctions. Rock art scattered across the Sahara provides some of the most haunting reminders of these vanished worlds. In remote regions now surrounded by desert, artists left images of cattle, wildlife, ceremonies, and daily life. Some scenes portray environments that no longer exist. Others suggest social and spiritual practices whose meanings remain uncertain. Looking at these images today creates a strange sensation. They are messages from people who never expected their world to disappear. The artists painted what they knew. They had no reason to imagine that future generations would encounter these images in landscapes transformed beyond recognition. Certain rock art traditions appear increasingly focused on cattle. This emphasis has attracted considerable attention because livestock seem to have played an important role in many Saharan societies. For some communities, cattle may have represented far more than food. They may have served as symbols of wealth, identity, social standing, and cultural continuity. If so, the migration of pastoral groups toward more favorable environments may have carried entire systems of belief and social organization with them. The people moving toward the Nile were not arriving empty-handed. They brought knowledge, traditions, and experiences shaped by centuries of life beyond the river. This possibility becomes especially significant when considering the later development of Egyptian culture. Ancient Egypt would eventually place enormous symbolic importance on cattle, fertility, sacred animals, and cyclical relationships between people and nature. It would be overly simplistic to claim direct continuity from every Saharan tradition to later Egyptian religion. The evidence does not support such certainty. Yet the parallels invite intriguing questions. How many cultural foundations originated long before the appearance of pharaohs? How many ideas developed in landscapes that have since vanished beneath sand? Another mystery involves the social structures of these disappearing communities. Archaeological evidence suggests considerable diversity across the Sahara. Some groups appear highly mobile, others seem more settled. Certain regions reveal signs of increasing social complexity, including elaborate burials and specialized activities. As environmental pressures intensified, these differences may have influenced how various communities responded. More flexible groups could relocate more easily. Others may have struggled to adapt. The outcome was likely different from place to place. The drying of the Sahara also reminds us that environmental change is not merely a backdrop to history. It often acts as a powerful force shaping human decisions. Climate does not dictate outcomes, but it influences the range of possibilities available. When water disappears, choices narrow. When fertile land contracts, populations concentrate elsewhere. Human agency remains central, yet it operates within environmental realities. The story unfolding across North Africa demonstrates this relationship with remarkable clarity. As centuries passed, regions that once supported abundant life became increasingly difficult to inhabit. Dunes expanded, vegetation retreated, water sources vanished. Travelers crossing these areas today encounter an environment that seems almost timeless. Yet geological evidence reveals how recent many of these transformations actually are. The Sahara's modern appearance can create the illusion that it has always been a desert. In truth, the desert itself has a history. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of this story is that countless individual lives remain invisible. Archaeology reveals broad patterns, but rarely personal experiences. We can identify migrations, environmental shifts, and changing settlement patterns, but we cannot know what people felt as familiar landscapes deteriorated around them. Did elders speak of greener times? Did families debate whether to leave ancestral territories? Did some believe the rains would eventually return? These questions may never be answered, yet they make the story feel remarkably human. Imagine standing beside a shrinking lake that had supported generations of your ancestors. The shoreline recedes a little farther each year. Fishing becomes more difficult. Herds travel greater distances in search of grazing land. Young people leave for places rumored to offer better opportunities. The changes are gradual enough to adapt to individually, yet relentless enough to transform everything collectively. Such experiences may have been repeated across enormous portions of North Africa. By the late stages of this environmental transition, the balance of power was quietly shifting toward regions capable of supporting larger, more stable populations. The Nile Valley increasingly occupied that role. Communities arriving there encountered fertile floodplains, expanding agricultural opportunities, and growing networks of exchange. The river was becoming more than a refuge. It was becoming a center. The disappearance of the Saharan tribes was therefore not simply an ending, it was also a beginning. Their world faded, but its people, knowledge, and traditions may have continued influencing events elsewhere. History often works this way. Entire cultures vanish from view, while portions of their legacy survive within new societies. The names may be forgotten, the landscapes may disappear, yet traces endure. What emerged along the Nile was not created in isolation. It was shaped by countless streams of human experience flowing together over generations. Some came from communities already living beside the river. Others may have arrived from regions transformed by climate change. Together, they contributed to a society becoming more connected, more complex, and more ambitious with each passing century. And as populations concentrated along the Nile, another transformation was already underway. Small farming communities were evolving into something larger. Wealth, trade, leadership, and social influence were beginning to accumulate unevenly. Certain settlements started gaining advantages over their neighbors. The foundations of power were taking shape. Long before the first pharaoh claimed authority, the earliest shadows of future kingdoms were beginning to appear along the riverbanks. By the time the Nile Valley began drawing larger populations into its fertile corridor, Something subtle but enormously important was taking place. The world was no longer made up solely of scattered farming villages connected loosely by trade and shared geography. Certain communities were beginning to pull ahead. Some controlled better farmland, others occupied strategic locations along travel routes. A few gained access to resources that neighboring settlements lacked. At first, the differences may have appeared modest, barely noticeable from one generation to the next. Yet, over centuries, these advantages accumulated. Wealth gathered in certain places, influence concentrated, leadership became more visible. The Nile was no longer simply supporting communities, it was beginning to produce centers of power. What makes this period so fascinating is that we are looking at a world that exists just before history becomes recognizable. There are no pharaohs yet, no unified Egyptian state, no monumental pyramids rising above the desert. But the forces that would eventually create those things are already at work beneath the surface. Like the first cracks appearing in ice before spring arrives, the signs are subtle but unmistakable. Human societies along the Nile were becoming more organized, more competitive, and more ambitious. Archaeologists often refer to several prehistoric cultures that flourished in Upper Egypt during this era, particularly those associated with regions such as Badari and Nakada. These names come from modern archaeological sites, not from the people themselves. The actual names these communities used for their settlements, leaders, and territories remain unknown. That uncertainty creates one of the most intriguing aspects of the story. We know these societies existed. We can examine their tools, homes, graves, and artwork. Yet the names by which they understood themselves have disappeared entirely. In a sense, we are looking at kingdoms before kingdoms had names. One of the clearest signs of growing complexity appears in burial practices. Earlier graves often display relative simplicity, but over time some burials became noticeably richer than others. Certain individuals were interred with finely crafted goods, decorative items, imported materials, and symbols of prestige. Such differences suggest that social status was becoming increasingly important. Not everyone occupied the same position within society. Some people possessed greater access to resources, influence, or authority. This raises an interesting question. How did leadership emerge in these communities? The answer remains uncertain because no written records survive from this period. It is possible that successful farmers accumulated wealth and influence over time. Some leaders may have gained authority through trade networks. Others may have earned prestige through religious roles, military skill, or the ability to organize labor. Human societies rarely develop according to a single formula. Different communities may have followed different paths toward hierarchy. Trade was becoming increasingly important. Archaeological discoveries reveal objects that originated far beyond the Nile Valley. Obsidian from distant regions, exotic stones, shells, pigments, and luxury goods traveled across impressive distances. These materials did not move by accident. They reflect growing networks of exchange connecting communities over hundreds of miles. Trade brought practical benefits, but it also created opportunities for certain settlements to become gateways between regions. Those who controlled important routes gained advantages that could translate into wealth and power. As these networks expanded, competition likely intensified. Resources were valuable. Trade opportunities were valuable. Productive farmland was valuable. Whenever something becomes valuable, people begin competing for control over it. Direct evidence for conflict during this period exists in several forms. Some archaeological sites contain signs of violence. Certain ceremonial objects depict scenes that may represent warfare, captive-taking, or displays of power. Interpretation remains difficult, but the broader pattern suggests that cooperation and competition were evolving side by side. The Nile itself contributed to this process. Although the river connected communities, it also concentrated populations within a relatively narrow corridor. As settlements grew larger, interactions became more frequent. Sometimes, those interactions involved trade and cooperation. Other times, they may have involved rivalry. Human history repeatedly demonstrates that proximity can generate both partnership and conflict. The Nile Valley was no exception. Among the most striking developments of this era is the emergence of specialized craftsmanship. Certain artisans began producing pottery, stone vessels, jewelry, ceremonial objects, and decorative items of remarkable quality. The skill involved is impressive even by modern standards. Such craftsmanship reveals more than technical ability. It suggests the existence of societies capable of supporting specialists who devoted significant time to activities beyond food production. This level of specialization represents an important milestone in social development. Art itself was changing. Earlier communities had certainly expressed creativity, but the imagery appearing during this period often carries new themes. Boats, animals, ritual scenes, and symbols of authority become increasingly prominent. Some objects seem to communicate ideas about power, identity, and social order. Certain motifs would later appear in forms associated with dynastic Egypt, though tracing direct continuity remains challenging. Even so, it becomes increasingly clear that many concepts often associated with ancient Egypt did not appear suddenly. Their roots reach back into these earlier societies. One particularly revealing development involves ceremonial centers. Some settlements grew beyond ordinary villages and began serving broader regional functions. These locations may have hosted rituals, gatherings, exchanges, and political activities. They acted as focal points within larger networks of communities. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Hierakonpolis suggests increasing social complexity and organization. These were not cities in the later sense, but they were becoming something more significant than simple farming settlements. Religion may have played an increasingly important role during this transition. Human societies often use shared beliefs to create cohesion, reinforce authority, and explain complex realities. While prehistoric religious systems remain difficult to reconstruct, certain symbols appear repeatedly in the archaeological record. Animals such as falcons, cattle, and other creatures seem to carry particular significance. Some ceremonial objects suggest emerging concepts of sacred authority. It is tempting to see early versions of later Egyptian religious traditions taking shape, though scholars remain cautious about drawing direct conclusions. At the same time, environmental stability continued supporting population growth. Agricultural production remained strong in many areas. Food surpluses enabled larger settlements. Larger settlements required greater organization. Greater organization created opportunities for leaders to consolidate authority. This process is not unique to Egypt. Similar patterns appear in various parts of the world. What makes the Nile Valley remarkable is how effectively these developments reinforced one another over time. Power was becoming increasingly visible. Certain individuals possessed access to luxury goods unavailable to others. Certain settlements dominated regional exchange networks. Certain leaders likely commanded larger followings than their rivals. The gap between ordinary communities and emerging centers of influence continued widening. What had once been a landscape of relatively equal villages was gradually transforming into something more hierarchical. Yet these emerging centers of power remained fragile. No single authority controlled the Nile Valley. Regional leaders competed for influence. Alliances likely formed and dissolved. Communities rose and declined. The political landscape may have resembled a mosaic of territories whose boundaries shifted over time. This fluidity makes the period difficult to reconstruct, but also deeply fascinating. We are witnessing the earliest stages of state formation before states fully existed. One intriguing possibility is that many later Egyptian traditions originated during this competitive environment. Symbols of authority, ceremonial practices, elite display, and political imagery may have developed as leaders sought ways to distinguish themselves from rivals. Power often requires visibility. Leaders must communicate status, legitimacy, and influence. The archaeological record increasingly suggests that such communication was becoming sophisticated long before the first pharaohs appeared. The emergence of inequality also carried consequences. Wealth accumulation can create opportunities for innovation, but it can also generate tension. Communities divided by status must develop systems that maintain stability. Leaders require legitimacy. Followers require incentives to cooperate. The solutions different societies create often shape their future trajectories. In the Nile Valley, these challenges appear to have encouraged increasingly complex forms of social organization. As centuries passed, certain centers grew stronger while others faded. Trade networks expanded further. Leadership structures became more elaborate. Population density increased. The pace of change accelerated. Looking back, it becomes clear that the Nile Valley was moving steadily toward a new stage of development. The ingredients necessary for larger political entities were accumulating. Wealth, population, leadership, symbolism, trade, and competition were all converging. What remains remarkable is how invisible this future would have been to the people living through it. They were not building Egypt. They were pursuing local ambitions, defending local interests, and responding to local opportunities. Yet collectively, their actions were creating something much larger than any individual community could have imagined. And among the settlements competing for influence, a handful would soon rise above the rest. Their leaders would command greater resources, attract larger populations, and project authority across wider territories. The age of unnamed regional powers was approaching its limit. Along the Nile, the first true proto-kingdoms were beginning to emerge, and with them came the earliest shadows of a unified Egypt waiting just beyond the horizon. If you could travel along the Nile around 4000 BCE, you would not find Egypt. Not yet. There would be no unified kingdom stretching from the Mediterranean to the First Cataract. No royal capital commanding the entire valley. No pharaoh seated upon a throne claiming divine authority over millions of people. Instead, you would encounter something far more unpredictable and, in many ways, more fascinating. Scattered along the river were growing centers of power, communities that had evolved far beyond simple villages, yet had not become true cities in the later sense. They existed in a world balanced between prehistory and civilization, standing on the threshold of an age that had not fully arrived. These were the proto-cities of the Nile, places where many of the foundations of ancient Egypt were quietly taking shape long before the first dynasty appeared in the historical record. One of the most remarkable aspects of this period is how quickly complexity seems to accelerate. For thousands of years, change had often unfolded gradually. Now, developments that once required centuries began occurring within the span of a few generations. Settlements expanded, trade intensified, leadership structures became more elaborate, social differences grew more visible. The pace itself becomes part of the story. Something was happening along the Nile that was drawing people, resources, and influence into a handful of increasingly important locations. Among the most significant of these centers was a place archaeologists call Hierakonpolis. The ancient inhabitants knew it by another name that would later become associated with the falcon god Horus, but its earliest identity remains partly hidden behind the veil of time. What is clear is that Hierakonpolis was becoming far more than a farming settlement. Excavations reveal workshops, ceremonial areas, elite residences, and evidence of specialized production. This was a place where authority was concentrated and displayed. People were not simply living here. They were organizing, producing, competing, and shaping a larger regional network. Walking through such a settlement would have revealed a world already moving beyond simple subsistence. Skilled artisans crafted pottery of extraordinary quality. Stoneworkers shaped ceremonial objects with remarkable precision. Traders arrived carrying materials from distant regions. Livestock moved through enclosures. Farmers transported grain from surrounding fields. Religious activities likely occupied specific spaces within the settlement. The community functioned as an interconnected system rather than a collection of isolated households. What makes these proto-cities especially important is their role as magnets. Wealth attracts people. Opportunity attracts people. Security attracts people. As certain settlements gained advantages, they pulled in surrounding populations. This process created feedback loops. More people meant more labor. More labor enabled greater production. Greater production increased wealth. Wealth enhanced influence. Influence attracted additional people. The cycle reinforced itself repeatedly. Another prominent center emerged at Nakada, a site so important that archaeologists use its name to describe entire cultural phases of late prehistoric Egypt. Nakada appears to have been deeply connected to expanding trade networks and growing political influence. Objects discovered there reveal contacts extending far beyond local communities. Materials from Nubia to the south, the eastern desert, and possibly regions farther east entered circulation through these developing networks. Such connections suggest a world that was becoming increasingly interconnected long before the rise of formal states. Trade during this period was not merely about acquiring useful materials. Exotic goods carried symbolic value. Rare stones, decorative objects, unusual animal products, and finely crafted items communicated status and prestige. Leaders who controlled access to these goods gained influence. Prestige became a political resource. The ability to display wealth often mattered almost as much as the wealth itself. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history, and its roots seem increasingly visible in the Nile Valley during this era. One particularly fascinating development is the growing importance of long-distance exchange. For earlier communities, most daily interactions occurred within relatively small geographic areas. By contrast, Proto-urban centers became connected to networks stretching hundreds of miles. Boats traveled along the Nile. Caravans crossed deserts. Traders carried not only goods, but information. New technologies, artistic styles, and ideas moved alongside physical commodities. The Nile was becoming an artery through which culture itself flowed. Archaeological evidence also points toward increasingly organized labor. Certain projects required cooperation on scales difficult to achieve without effective leadership. Large structures, communal facilities, and specialized production zones suggest that individuals were capable of mobilizing groups for shared goals. This ability would later become one of the defining characteristics of Egyptian civilization. Long before pyramids appeared, people were already learning how to coordinate complex tasks involving large numbers of participants. Religion likely played a crucial role in this process. Shared beliefs can unite communities, justify authority, and reinforce social cohesion. Although the religious systems of these proto-cities remain only partially understood, evidence suggests growing ceremonial complexity. Temples in the later sense may not yet have existed, but ritual spaces clearly held significance. Certain symbols appear repeatedly. Animals such as falcons, cattle, and other creatures carried increasing symbolic weight. The language of power was becoming intertwined with the language of belief. At Hierakonpolis, archaeologists uncovered evidence of elaborate ceremonial activity, including unusual burials and structures that may have served communal ritual functions. Some discoveries hint at emerging concepts of sacred leadership. The exact meaning remains debated, but the pattern is difficult to ignore. Political authority and spiritual authority were increasingly overlapping. Leaders were becoming more than administrators. They were beginning to occupy symbolic roles within their societies. The emergence of elite cemeteries offers another revealing glimpse into this transformation. Certain individuals received burial treatments vastly different from those of ordinary people. Rich grave goods, imported materials, and carefully planned tombs suggest growing social stratification. Death itself became a stage upon which power could be displayed. The differences between rulers and followers were becoming more visible, more formalized, and perhaps more widely accepted. What is especially intriguing is that these proto-cities did not develop in isolation from one another. They existed within a competitive landscape. Multiple centers sought influence. Multiple leaders pursued prestige. Multiple communities attempted to expand their reach. The Nile Valley increasingly resembled a political chessboard whose pieces were constantly moving. Alliances may have formed, rivalries certainly emerged. Economic competition likely intensified. Every successful settlement represented both an opportunity and a threat to its neighbors. Some archaeological evidence hints at conflict during this period. Weapons appear in elite contexts. Certain artistic scenes depict confrontations, captives, and demonstrations of dominance. Interpreting prehistoric imagery is notoriously difficult, but the broader context suggests that power was not always negotiated peacefully. As communities grew larger and more ambitious, competition became unavoidable. The resources at stake, land, trade routes, labor, prestige, were simply too valuable. Yet conflict alone does not explain the rise of these centers. Equally important was their ability to provide benefits. People generally support leadership when it offers advantages. Strong settlements could organize irrigation, coordinate trade, maintain security, and distribute resources. Authority survived not merely through force, but through usefulness. The most successful centers were those capable of solving problems that smaller communities could not address alone. As these proto-cities expanded, something even more significant was happening beneath the surface. Shared cultural patterns were spreading across the Nile Valley. Artistic styles became increasingly similar. Religious symbols appeared in multiple regions. Elite practices showed growing consistency. The people living hundreds of miles apart were not yet members of a single kingdom, but they were beginning to participate in a common cultural world. This development may prove just as important as political competition. A state cannot emerge unless people first develop enough shared identity to imagine belonging to something larger than their local community. One of the most striking examples involves the growing use of symbolic imagery associated with authority. Certain motifs that would later become iconic elements of Egyptian kingship begin appearing in elite contexts. These symbols did not emerge suddenly with the first pharaohs. They evolved gradually within the competitive environment of the proto-cities. Leaders experimented with visual language. Over time, successful symbols spread and became standardized. The process resembles the formation of a new political vocabulary. Communities needed ways to communicate power, legitimacy, and leadership. Through repeated use, certain images acquired meaning. A falcon could represent more than a bird. A ceremonial mace could symbolize authority. Particular forms of dress or decoration could distinguish elites from ordinary people. These visual systems would eventually become central to Egyptian civilization. Looking back, it is tempting to focus only on the winners. We remember the societies that led to dynastic Egypt because their descendants built monuments and left written records. Yet many competing centers likely disappeared, declined, or were absorbed by stronger rivals. The archaeological record preserves fragments of their existence, but their stories remain incomplete. History often narrows our view toward successful outcomes, obscuring the many alternative futures that once seemed possible. By the late 4th millennium BCE, however, one reality was becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. The balance of power along the Nile was shifting. Some settlements were no longer merely influential communities. They were becoming regional capitals, capable of projecting authority far beyond their immediate surroundings. Their leaders commanded resources, labor, and prestige on scales previously unimaginable. The age of scattered proto-cities was beginning to reach its climax. The unnamed kingdoms of the Nile had grown larger, richer, and more ambitious. Their rulers no longer competed solely for local influence. They were competing for something greater. Somewhere among these rising centers, the idea of a unified realm was beginning to emerge. Not yet as a nation, not yet as an empire, but as a possibility. And once that possibility entered the minds of ambitious leaders, the history of the Nile Valley would never be the same again. Long before towering temples lined the Nile, and long before priests recorded sacred rituals on papyrus, something less visible, but perhaps even more important, was taking shape within the minds of the people living along the river. The future gods of Egypt did not simply appear one day as fully formed divine beings. They emerged gradually from thousands of years of observation, fear, wonder, survival, memory, and imagination. Before there were official myths, before there were sacred texts, before there was even a unified kingdom, there were questions. Why did the Nile flood with such reliability? Why did the sun return every morning after disappearing each night? Why did some people prosper while others suffered? Why did life emerge from the earth and eventually return to it? These questions existed long before written history, and the search for answers would help shape one of the most influential religious traditions the world has ever known. To understand how the earliest Egyptian gods may have emerged, it helps to imagine life from the perspective of those proto-city communities scattered along the Nile. Every aspect of survival depended on forces beyond human control. The annual flood could nourish fields or arrive at unusual levels. Storms could destroy crops. Disease could appear without warning. Death was ever present. Yet alongside these dangers existed remarkable patterns. The river flooded, the waters retreated, crops grew, seasons changed. The sun followed its path across the sky with astonishing consistency. In a world that often seemed unpredictable, certain rhythms appeared almost eternal. Human beings have always searched for meaning within patterns. Across cultures and continents, people tend to personify forces that shape their lives. Rivers become spirits. Mountains become sacred. Animals acquire symbolic significance. The ancient Nile Valley was likely no exception. Archaeological evidence suggests that long before dynastic Egypt, people were already assigning symbolic importance to animals, landscapes, and natural phenomena. The exact beliefs remain difficult to reconstruct, but the patterns are unmistakable. One of the most fascinating aspects of early Egyptian religion is the role played by animals. Falcons, cattle, crocodiles, ibises, jackals, and many other creatures would eventually become associated with major deities. To modern observers, this can seem unusual. Yet within the context of prehistoric life, the symbolism makes sense. Animals were not distant curiosities. They were powerful presences sharing the same world. A falcon soaring high above the landscape possessed abilities humans lacked. A crocodile commanded respect within the waterways. A bull embodied strength and fertility. These creatures naturally inspired awe. The falcon offers an especially revealing example. Long before Horus became one of Egypt's most important gods, falcon imagery appears repeatedly within archaeological contexts associated with leadership and authority. Some scholars suggest that powerful birds of prey may have symbolized dominance because they occupied the highest position within the visible sky. Watching a falcon glide above the Nile Valley, seemingly untouched by earthly limitations, it is easy to understand how people might have associated such a creature with power, protection, or divine oversight. Cattle occupied another important place within emerging belief systems. Their significance extended beyond economics. Livestock represented wealth, survival, fertility, and continuity. Communities depended upon healthy herds. It is therefore unsurprising that cattle imagery appears frequently within ceremonial contexts. Some researchers believe certain bovine symbols may represent early fertility cults or concepts related to abundance and renewal. Although direct evidence remains limited, the connection between cattle and sacred symbolism appears deeply rooted. The Nile itself may have been among the earliest sacred forces of all. Even before formal gods were assigned to specific aspects of the river, people undoubtedly recognized its unique role in sustaining life. Every year, the flood transformed dry soil into fertile farmland. Without the river, large-scale settlement would have been impossible. In many ancient societies, life-giving rivers acquired spiritual significance naturally. The Nile's central role in Egyptian religion may therefore reflect a much older tradition stretching back into prehistory. Death also played a crucial role in shaping spiritual thought. Archaeological evidence from pre-dynastic cemeteries reveals increasingly elaborate burial practices. People did not simply dispose of the dead. They buried them carefully. Objects accompanied them into the grave. Bodies were positioned intentionally. Such actions suggest beliefs extending beyond immediate physical existence. While it would be misleading to project later Egyptian concepts directly onto these early communities, the evidence indicates growing concern with memory, identity, and perhaps some form of continued existence after death. One intriguing possibility is that the harsh environmental contrast between fertile land and surrounding desert influenced religious imagination. Along the Nile, life flourished. Beyond the river valley stretched increasingly arid landscapes. This stark contrast between life and barrenness must have been impossible to ignore. Some scholars suggest that such environmental realities may have helped shape later Egyptian concepts of order and chaos. Although definitive proof remains elusive, the idea is compelling. Geography often influences mythology in subtle but powerful ways. As settlements expanded and social hierarchies became more pronounced, religion likely acquired additional functions. Shared beliefs help unify communities. They create common identities. They provide explanations for social structures. Leaders throughout history have often drawn legitimacy from spiritual authority, and early Nile societies may have begun exploring similar relationships. Symbols associated with sacred power increasingly appear alongside symbols associated with political influence. The overlap is difficult to dismiss. At sites such as Hierakonpolis, archaeologists have uncovered ceremonial spaces suggesting organized ritual activity. Some structures appear designed for gatherings that went beyond ordinary daily life. These discoveries hint at communities investing time, labor, and resources into activities that carried symbolic significance. Ritual was becoming a public affair rather than merely a private experience. Shared ceremonies may have reinforced social bonds while simultaneously strengthening emerging leadership structures. One of the most mysterious aspects of this period involves symbolic imagery that appears surprisingly sophisticated despite the absence of written explanations. Certain motifs recur across multiple sites. Specific animals, ceremonial objects, and visual patterns seem to carry meanings understood by the people who created them. Unfortunately, the symbolic language itself remains largely inaccessible. We can observe the symbols, we can identify patterns, but their exact interpretations remain uncertain. In many ways, we are observing the earliest chapters of a religious story whose ending is already known, but whose beginning remains partly hidden. Some scholars have proposed that many later Egyptian gods originated through the merging of local cults. Different communities may have revered different sacred animals, spirits, or protective forces. As interaction between settlements increased, these traditions could have blended, competed, or evolved. If true, the gods of dynastic Egypt may not have emerged from a single source, but from centuries of cultural exchange. The religion that later appeared unified may have begun as a mosaic of local beliefs scattered across the Nile Valley. The sun almost certainly occupied a special place within this evolving worldview. Its daily journey across the sky was among the most visible and reliable patterns in nature. Sunrise brought warmth, light, and activity. Sunset brought uncertainty and darkness. Long before the formal worship of solar deities, people may have attached profound symbolic significance to this cycle. Across many ancient cultures, the sun became associated with creation, authority, and renewal. Egypt would eventually develop some of the world's most sophisticated solar theology, but its roots likely extend far into prehistory. Another important development involves the growing connection between sacred symbols and leadership. Certain elite individuals appear increasingly linked to ceremonial authority. Objects associated with status often carry religious imagery. This suggests that political power and spiritual power were becoming intertwined. A leader who could claim special relationships with sacred forces gained advantages extending beyond wealth or military strength. Legitimacy became a form of power in its own right. What makes this period particularly fascinating is that religion was still fluid. The great gods familiar from later Egyptian mythology had not yet reached their final forms. Horus was not fully Horus. Hathor was not fully Hathor. The religious universe remained open, evolving alongside the societies that created it. Symbols shifted, meanings developed, traditions merged. We are witnessing not a finished system, but the process through which one gradually emerged. This process mirrors the broader transformation occurring throughout the Nile Valley. Communities were becoming larger. Political influence was becoming more concentrated. Trade networks were expanding. Social identities were evolving. Religion did not develop separately from these changes. It developed because of them. Human beings were creating frameworks capable of explaining a world growing increasingly complex. The remarkable thing is how enduring many of these ideas would become. Concepts emerging during this distant period would survive for thousands of years. Future pharaohs would invoke gods whose earliest origins may trace back to prehistoric communities struggling to understand the forces shaping their lives. Massive temples would eventually honor deities whose symbolic foundations were laid long before the first stone monuments appeared. Yet, religion alone could not unify the Nile Valley. Shared beliefs could connect people, but political power still remained divided among competing centers. Rival leaders continued seeking influence. Regional authorities continued expanding their reach. The sacred world was becoming more organized, but the political world remained fragmented. That tension could not last forever. Somewhere along the river, ambitious rulers were beginning to imagine something larger than local authority. The age of competing proto-kingdoms was approaching its final act, and the struggle that followed would determine who would ultimately rule the Nile. For thousands of years, the Nile had connected people without truly uniting them. Villages became towns, towns evolved into regional centers, and powerful communities rose and fell along the river's banks. Trade moved between them. Ideas spread between them. Religious symbols began to resemble one another. Yet politically, the valley remained divided. Different leaders controlled different territories. Different regions pursued their own ambitions. The river flowed through a landscape of competing powers, each convinced of its own importance. Then, sometime near the end of the 4th millennium BCE, something extraordinary happened. One of the oldest political puzzles in human history began to unfold. The Nile Valley, stretching for hundreds of miles through northeastern Africa, started transforming from a collection of rival centers into a single kingdom. The outcome would change world history. The process itself remains surprisingly mysterious. What makes this story so compelling is how little certainty exists compared to the significance of the event. Historians agree that unification occurred. Archaeologists can see the results clearly. A centralized Egyptian state emerged. Dynasties appeared. Kings ruled territories on a scale previously unseen along the Nile. Yet when we attempt to reconstruct exactly how this happened, the evidence becomes far less straightforward. The closer we move to the moment of unification, the more history begins to resemble a shadow viewed through fog. By this stage, several powerful centers dominated portions of the Nile Valley. Hierakonpolis, Nakada, Abydos, and other influential regions possessed wealth, trade connections, religious importance, and growing political authority. Their leaders controlled resources, commanded labor, and likely maintained networks of allies and supporters. These were no longer simple local chiefs. They were rulers operating within increasingly sophisticated political landscapes. Competition among these centers seems almost inevitable. Wealth was concentrated unevenly. Strategic locations mattered. Trade routes generated influence. Agricultural production supported growing populations. Every successful center had reasons to expand its reach. Throughout human history, neighboring powers rarely remain equal forever. Eventually, one gains an advantage. The challenge is determining exactly how that process unfolded along the Nile. Some scholars believe military conquest played a central role. Certain artifacts appear to depict scenes of warfare, victory, and domination. Elite ceremonial objects show rulers overpowering enemies, capturing opponents, and displaying authority. One famous example, known as the Narmer palette, has become one of the most important pieces of evidence from this period. Carved over 5,000 years ago, it depicts a ruler traditionally identified as Narmer, performing acts associated with conquest and kingship. For many historians, it represents a symbolic record of political unification. Yet even the Narmer palette raises questions. Was it documenting an actual historical event? Was it celebrating a series of campaigns? Was it presenting an idealized vision of royal power rather than a literal account? Ancient political imagery often served multiple purposes simultaneously. Victorious rulers throughout history have exaggerated achievements, emphasized legitimacy, and used symbolism to strengthen authority. The palette remains enormously important, but its precise meaning continues to inspire debate. This uncertainty highlights a broader issue. Unification may not have been a single event at all. Modern audiences often imagine history as a sequence of dramatic turning points. One battle occurs, one king triumphs, a new nation is born. Reality is often more complicated. Some researchers suggest that Egyptian unification may have unfolded gradually over generations. Political alliances, economic integration, dynastic marriages, religious influence, and military pressure could all have contributed. Rather than a single moment, the process may have resembled a long series of interconnected developments. The geography of the Nile itself encouraged this possibility. Unlike many regions divided by mountains or vast distances, The Nile Valley naturally connected populations through a continuous river corridor. Communication, trade, and movement occurred with relative ease. Over time, powerful rulers may have found it increasingly practical to extend authority beyond local boundaries. The river created opportunities for centralized administration long before such administration actually existed. Abydos appears to have played a particularly important role during this transition. Archaeological discoveries there include some of the earliest royal tombs associated with emerging kingship. These burials suggest the existence of rulers whose authority extended far beyond individual settlements. The scale of the tombs, the richness of the grave goods, and the evidence of organized labor all point toward increasingly centralized power. Something new was happening. Leadership was evolving into kingship. One of the most intriguing developments involves the growing use of royal symbolism. Earlier leaders had displayed status through wealth and ceremonial objects. Now, a more standardized language of authority was emerging. Specific crowns, animal symbols, ceremonial weapons, and visual motifs became associated with rulership itself. The appearance of these symbols suggests that power was becoming institutional rather than purely personal. A ruler was no longer simply a successful individual. He represented an office, an idea, and eventually a state. The famous distinction between Upper and Lower Egypt lies at the center of this transformation. To modern ears, the terminology sounds backward. Upper Egypt refers to the southern Nile Valley, while Lower Egypt refers to the northern Delta region. The names derive from the river's flow rather than geographic orientation. For centuries, these regions developed somewhat differently. They possessed distinct identities, local traditions, and political structures. The unification process appears to have brought them together under a single authority. How exactly this occurred remains one of the great unanswered questions. Traditional accounts emphasize conquest by rulers from Upper Egypt. Archaeological evidence provides some support for this interpretation, particularly given the prominence of southern centers during the final stages of state formation. However, the story may not have been purely military. Economic integration likely mattered. Shared religious traditions likely mattered. Administrative innovations likely mattered. Political systems rarely survive through force alone. They endure because enough people perceive advantages in participation. Another fascinating aspect involves the emergence of writing. The earliest Egyptian writing appears around this same period, though initially in limited forms. Simple inscriptions and administrative markings begin appearing within archaeological contexts. The timing is significant. Complex states require information management. Goods must be tracked. Resources must be counted. Authority must be communicated across distances. Writing did not create the Egyptian state, but it may have become one of the tools that allowed the state to function effectively. As centralized authority expanded, rulers faced a challenge familiar to governments throughout history. How do you convince distant populations to accept your legitimacy? Military strength can establish power, but maintaining it requires something more. Symbols, religion, tradition, and administration all contribute. The emerging kings of Egypt appear remarkably skilled at combining these elements. They presented themselves not merely as political leaders, but as figures connected to divine order itself. This connection between kingship and cosmic stability would become one of the defining features of Egyptian civilization. The king was not simply expected to govern, he was expected to preserve harmony, maintain order, and ensure the proper functioning of the world. While these ideas reached their fullest expression later, Their foundations appear during the unification era. Political authority and sacred authority were becoming inseparable. Looking at the archaeological evidence, one can almost sense the acceleration of history. Settlements grow larger. Administrative systems become more visible. Elite burials become more elaborate. Royal symbolism becomes more standardized. Trade networks expand. Writing appears. Different developments that had been evolving separately begin converging into a coherent system. The pieces are coming together. And yet the human side of the story remains largely hidden. We know the names of only a handful of individuals from this era. We do not know the conversations that shaped decisions. We do not know how ordinary farmers viewed the rise of centralized authority. We do not know whether some communities welcomed unification while others resisted. The voices of most participants have disappeared, leaving only fragments from which we reconstruct the larger narrative. Perhaps that uncertainty is part of what makes the story so enduring. The birth of Egypt stands among the most consequential political transformations in ancient history, yet many of its details remain elusive. It occupies a space between archaeology and legend, between documented history and informed reconstruction. We can see the destination clearly, but much of the journey remains hidden. By approximately 3100 BCE, however, the result had become impossible to ignore. A unified Egyptian state existed. The age of competing regional powers was ending. The first dynasties were beginning. Authority extended across vast portions of the Nile Valley. Administrative systems were emerging. Royal institutions were taking shape. Egypt had entered history. Yet even at this remarkable moment, the civilization most people imagine had not fully arrived. The pyramids did not exist. The giant stone temples had not been built. The monumental age of pharaohs was still waiting in the future. What had emerged was not the Egypt of postcards and documentaries, but the foundation upon which that Egypt would be constructed. The river had been united. The state had been born. And now, for the first time, the rulers of the Nile possessed something their predecessors could scarcely have imagined: the ability to reshape an entire civilization according to a single vision. The sun rises slowly over the Nile. Mist drifts above the water as the first light touches fields that generations of farmers have cultivated for centuries. Boats move quietly along the river. Workers begin their daily routines. Livestock stir in their enclosures. To an ordinary observer, the landscape might appear familiar, not dramatically different from what it had been only a few generations earlier. Yet beneath that appearance, something profound has changed. For the first time in history, the Nile Valley is no longer a collection of competing regions loosely connected by geography and trade. It is becoming a kingdom. The long process that began with scattered communities, migrating peoples, growing settlements, and emerging leaders has reached a new stage. The age of the Pharaohs is beginning. One of the most remarkable aspects of this transition is how quickly a newly unified state began transforming itself. Creating a kingdom is one challenge. Holding it together is another entirely. The rulers of early Egypt inherited a landscape stretching hundreds of miles. Communities separated by great distances needed to be connected administratively, economically, and symbolically. Authority had to travel farther than ever before. Information had to move more efficiently. Resources had to be managed on an unprecedented scale. The earliest kings faced problems that no previous generation along the Nile had encountered. Archaeological evidence suggests that these rulers approached the challenge with remarkable effectiveness. Administrative systems expanded. Officials were appointed to oversee different regions. Storage facilities grew larger. Records became increasingly important. What had once been local concerns were now matters of state. Grain production, labor organization, trade, and taxation all required coordination. The emergence of government was not an abstract political development. It was a practical response to the realities of managing a growing kingdom. Writing played a crucial role in this transformation. Earlier forms of symbolic communication existed, but now writing began evolving into a more sophisticated tool for administration. The earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions appear during this period, providing glimpses into a world that had previously remained silent. Names could be recorded, goods could be counted, ownership could be tracked, royal authority could be communicated. Writing gave permanence to information in ways memory alone never could. What makes this development especially significant is that writing did not emerge primarily as literature. The first written symbols were closely connected to administration, economics, and power. Kingdoms require records. Records require writing. The growth of the Egyptian state and the growth of written communication appear deeply interconnected. The bureaucratic foundations of civilization were beginning to form. At the center of this system stood the king. Yet the role of the king was unlike that of most rulers in human history. In many societies, leaders derive authority from military strength, wealth, or political support. Early Egyptian kings certainly possessed these advantages, but they also claimed something more. They presented themselves as essential to the functioning of the cosmos itself. The king was not merely a governor, he was a bridge between the human world and the divine order that sustained it. This idea may seem extraordinary, but it solved a practical problem. A newly unified kingdom needed a shared identity. People living hundreds of miles apart required a reason to see themselves as participants in a common system. Religion provided part of the answer. If the king represented divine order, loyalty to the king became more than a political obligation. It became a contribution to the stability of the world itself. The concept would later develop into the Egyptian principle known as ma'at, often translated as order, balance, harmony, or truth. Although the idea reached its fullest expression in later centuries, its foundations likely emerged during these formative years. The kingdom presented itself not merely as a political structure, but as the embodiment of cosmic stability. In a landscape shaped by the predictable rhythms of the Nile, such ideas carried powerful resonance. Meanwhile, royal symbolism became increasingly sophisticated. Crowns, ceremonial objects, sacred animals, and visual motifs communicated authority throughout the kingdom. These symbols mattered because most people would never meet the king personally. Images became extensions of power. They allowed royal authority to exist simultaneously in multiple places. Every symbol reinforced the message that a single ruler governed the entire Nile Valley. The architecture of the period reveals another important transformation. Contrary to popular imagination, the first pharaohs did not immediately construct gigantic stone monuments. Early royal buildings were often made from mud brick and other perishable materials. Much has disappeared. Yet archaeological evidence suggests ambitious construction projects were already underway. Palaces, Administrative complexes, storage facilities, and ceremonial structures reflected growing organizational capacity. The kingdom was learning how to mobilize labor on scales previously unimaginable. Trade expanded dramatically as well. The unified state possessed advantages unavailable to earlier regional powers. Larger territories meant greater access to resources. Stronger administration improved coordination. Security encouraged exchange. Egyptian goods moved beyond the Nile Valley while foreign materials entered the kingdom. Gold, stone, timber, luxury items, and exotic products circulated through expanding networks. Egypt was becoming an increasingly important participant within the wider ancient world. One fascinating development involves the kingdom's relationship with neighboring regions. Earlier communities had interacted with surrounding peoples primarily through local networks. Now, rulers could pursue broader strategies. Trade expeditions ventured farther. Diplomatic relationships likely emerged. Military campaigns may have secured resources or protected economic interests. The horizons of Egyptian society were expanding rapidly. At the same time, ordinary life continued. Farmers still planted crops, fishermen still worked the river, craftsmen still produced tools and pottery. Most people probably experienced the rise of kingship through gradual changes rather than dramatic events. Taxes may have increased, officials may have become more visible, religious ceremonies may have grown more elaborate. Yet daily routines remained rooted in the rhythms of the Nile. This continuity is important because civilizations are built not only by rulers, but by millions of ordinary actions repeated over generations. One of the most intriguing mysteries of the early dynastic period concerns how quickly Egyptian culture achieved a remarkable degree of consistency. Artistic styles, religious symbols, administrative practices, and royal imagery became recognizable across large portions of the kingdom. This cultural coherence helped strengthen political unity. Shared symbols created shared identities. The kingdom was becoming more than a territory. It was becoming a civilization. Royal tombs from this era provide some of the most revealing evidence. Located primarily at Abydos and other important centers, these burials demonstrate increasing wealth, organization, and symbolic sophistication. Some contain imported materials from distant regions. Others reveal evidence of large-scale labor mobilization. The tombs communicate a powerful message. The rulers buried within them were no longer local leaders. They were kings of a kingdom. Death itself became increasingly tied to royal ideology. Earlier communities had developed traditions concerning burial and remembrance, but now kingship elevated these practices to new levels. The ruler's death was not simply a personal event. It carried political, religious, and symbolic significance. The continuity of authority depended on successful succession. Stability required that the kingdom survive beyond the lifespan of any individual ruler. As centuries passed, the administrative and ideological foundations established by the earliest pharaohs grew stronger. Institutions became more durable. Knowledge accumulated. Engineering capabilities improved. Organizational experience expanded. Each generation inherited systems developed by those who came before. Civilization was becoming self-reinforcing. Looking back, it is tempting to focus on what was still absent. The Great Pyramid had not yet been built. The monumental temples of Luxor and Karnak did not exist. The famous golden treasures of later periods remained far in the future. Yet this perspective risks overlooking the true significance of the era. The greatest achievement of the earliest pharaohs was not a monument. It was the creation of a framework capable of producing monuments. Everything that would later make Egypt famous was becoming possible because of foundations laid during this period. Centralized government, organized labor, administrative expertise, religious legitimacy, written communication, economic coordination, and shared cultural identity were all coming together. These elements transformed a river valley into one of history's most enduring civilizations. Perhaps the most remarkable realization is how improbable the entire process appears when viewed from the beginning. Thousands of years earlier, migrating communities moved through changing landscapes shaped by climate shifts and environmental uncertainty. Small settlements experimented with agriculture. Regional leaders competed for influence. Religious ideas evolved gradually. None of these developments guaranteed the emergence of a kingdom. History could have followed many different paths. Yet along the Nile, an extraordinary convergence occurred. Geography, climate, human ingenuity, trade, belief, leadership, and adaptation aligned in ways that created something unique. The pharaohs did not appear out of nowhere. They were the result of countless generations whose names have been forgotten, but whose choices shaped the future. And now, as the sun climbs higher above the Nile and illuminates a newly unified kingdom, the world stands at the threshold of a new age. The mysterious tribes of the Sahara are gone. The unnamed proto-kingdoms have disappeared into history. The struggle for unification has ended. In their place stands Egypt, organized, ambitious, confident, and increasingly aware of its own power. The age before the pharaohs is over. The age of the pharaohs has begun. Soon, this civilization will attempt projects so ambitious that they will astonish the world for thousands of years. Stone monuments will rise above the desert. Kings will seek immortality. And the Nile, which witnessed every step of the journey, will continue flowing northward just as it always has, carrying the story of Egypt into history. Thank you for spending this time with Sleepy Earth Channel. If you enjoyed this journey into the ancient world, please subscribe and leave a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from and what mystery, civilization, or forgotten chapter of history you'd like us to explore next. Wishing you good luck, peaceful rest, and a wonderful day or night ahead.